courtesy to those around you, we ask you to please turn off or silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. Please take a moment to locate the exit nearest to you, marked with the red exit sign. This is the route you should take in the unlikely event of an emergency. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Larry Nabatoff, Chair of the Learning Society.
Good evening. My name is Larry Nabatoff. My wife Kelly and I serve as co-chairs of the Executive Committee for the Learning Society. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Sandra Levine Theater for our fall lecture featuring Jared Diamond and David Wallace-Wells. Since 1988, the Learning Society of Queens has served as an intellectual catalyst for both Queens students and the broader Charlotte community. Tonight, Dr. Jared Diamond and David Wallace-Wells join the likes of Doris Kearns-Goodwin, Walter Isaacson, Salman Rushdie, James Comey, Michelle Alexander, Condoleezza Rice, Captain Scott Kelly, Dan Rather, and others in broadening the lens through which Queens students understand and contribute to the world. Thank you for being here tonight. And to our members, thank you for supporting such an impactful program. We are also grateful for the support of our sponsors, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize them by name, as tonight's program would not be possible without them. Our platinum sponsor, Duke Energy. Our gold sponsors, Hospice and Palliative Care, Charlotte Region. Foundation for the Carolinas and Sharon Towers. And our silver sponsors, the Broyhill Family Foundation and WFAE 90.7 FM. Please join me in a round of applause for all of our sponsors. Now, I would like to welcome to the stage the president of Queens University of Charlotte, Dan Lugo.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you to the Learning Society and its leadership for 34 years of influential programming on this campus and in this great city. I also want to add a personal thanks to our sponsors this evening. We are grateful for your generosity in allowing us to explore timely, important, and relevant topics with some of the leading minds of our time. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's great to have you here on campus for a program that I have to readily admit makes me simultaneously terrified and hopeful, right, for the future. And if you're familiar with either of our authors tonight and the work that they do, you can probably understand a bit where I'm coming from in those feelings. We've gathered here again to talk about hard but necessary subjects, to lean into a world rife with challenges and crises and change. As an institution of higher learning, it's imperative that we do this work. Our mission is to not only provide transformative educational experiences within our classrooms, but to prepare our students for lives of purpose beyond the classroom, to improve their ability to interact with one another, to free them from the limitations of their own minds and experiences, and to grow comfortable with risk and to appreciate differences. In short, our goal at Queens is to make this world a better place through education. And education is a powerful vehicle to address challenges and undo the wrongs of the past and shape a better future for all of us. I'm grateful that you're here tonight because we cannot do this work alone. This university, or any university for that matter, shouldn't be an island unto itself in our pristine neighborhood, in a growing city, in one of the richest countries in the world. We should be a bridge instead. And Queens is fully committed to being a leader and convener in Charlotte, a nexus of talent, ideas, and resources that position us to help address the greatest challenges of this city and the world beyond. Earlier this fall, we launched the Charlotte Talent Initiative, an immersive cohort program designed to change the economic trajectories of graduates from the Mecklenburg County high schools. The success of CTI, in partnership with powerful local organizations and companies like Lowe's and Ally, enables us to enroll and retain and educate more talented low-income students who are poised to make a meaningful contribution to our community and the world after graduation. We also established the Center for Digital Equity as part of a collective impact strategy that brings together public and private partners with the goal of making Mecklenburg County the most digitally equitable community in America. Tonight's challenge is that of climate change. Our young people are inheriting a planet in crisis, and they need the older people, those in power, to acknowledge the crisis and to address it. Now, Queen's University and the City of Charlotte are inextricably linked, and we take our role in this ecosystem very seriously. Together, we need to be a gateway for innovation, empathy, and action. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Jared Diamond is one of the world's leading scientists and a #1 New York Times best-selling author. His book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, won the Pulitzer Prize, and it, along with his recent books titled Collapse and Upheaval, help us better understand how both nations and individuals respond to times of crisis and change. Among his many awards are the National Medal of Science, the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, and the MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. He holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and is currently professor of geography at the University of California, Los Angeles. Joining Dr. Diamond tonight is David Wallace-Wells, the New York Times best-selling author of The Uninhabitable Earth, a critically hailed look at the consequences of global warming. The Uninhabitable Earth was named among the New Yorker's favorite books of 2019 and was also one of Time magazine's 100 most read books of that same year. Previously, as the deputy editor of New York Magazine, he was the deputy editor of New York Magazine. David is currently a columnist and staff writer at the New York Times, where he continues to explore climate change, technology, and the future of our planet and how we live on it. I hope you will all join me in giving a very warm Queens and Charlotte welcome to Jared and David.
Thank you, President Lugo. That was a great introduction. This is a bit of an unusual format. It's sort of like somewhere between a straight interview and a conversation. So I'm going to be leading, but we're also going to be having some back and forth, I hope. And I hope at the end I think we're going to have some questions from students. I think President Lugo said terrified and optimistic, or terrified and hopeful. I don't remember exactly what word he used, but we're probably going to be touching on both of those areas tonight in different ways. And I thought we could start at the really big picture. We are looking at a world that is in a moment of upheaval, to coin a phrase, coming out of the pandemic, facing supply chain issues, energy crises, inflation, a period of deglobalization. It's sort of a cascading series of challenges that the world that many of us used to take for granted is now facing. Let's start with the pandemic. For you, what were the lessons of that experience? How should we use it to think about our future and our ability to face down and deal with the new crises on the horizon that we haven't yet encountered yet?
Lessons of the pandemic. I would begin just by stating my pleasure in being back to North Carolina. My first visit to North Carolina was 73 and a half years ago. I came here for my 12th birthday with my father, who as a pediatrician was advising the oldest pediatrician in the state of North Carolina. and I've been back to North Carolina frequently ever since on camping trips, and because my son was co-captain of the Duke rugby team, which went around North Carolina playing various. So I'm delighted to be back, especially at this time when it's so beautiful out. Lessons of the pandemic. There are multiple lessons of the pandemic. The most immediate specific lesson is when we say the pandemic, this is not the last pandemic. The only thing that was distinctive about this pandemic that made it a pandemic was globalization, jet planes, but otherwise there have been numerous emergent diseases in the last 50 years that spread, such as AIDS, mad cow disease, Ebola. This one spread faster because of jet planes. And there are going to be more pandemics. There's nothing distinctive about this particular one, except that it took advantage of jet planes, which became worldwide transport in the last 20 years. We've already had monkeypox. We're going to have other pandemics. That's one lesson of the pandemic. We have to be prepared for them. The biggest lesson of the pandemic is that it's a global problem that affects every country in the world, and it requires a global solution. There's no country that can solve its COVID problem by itself. New Zealand tried, Australia tried, China is trying, but in these days of travel and globalization and jet airplanes, no country can eliminate COVID within its borders forever because it will just get reinfected. But there are now, thanks to jet planes, other global problems that require global solutions. Climate change, of course. If the United States reduced our consumption of fossil fuels in the hope that that would solve climate change in the United States, of course not, because carbon dioxide mixes in the atmosphere just as COVID microbes mix with people. So climate change, like COVID, is a global problem requiring global solutions. And in this era of globalization, we are going to have more and more global problems that no country can solve by itself, but that demand global solutions.
So thinking of the pandemic particularly as a global challenge that required a global solution, how do you grade our solution? I mean, when I think about it, I think actually in ways that we often forget, the first few months of the pandemic were an incredible expression of global solidarity. People stayed home, suspended their social lives, their professional lives, their romantic lives, their family lives to protect themselves and the people around them for months. It was an unprecedented global disruption to our daily lives. And we were doing that out of a sense that we were in this together. But that sense of togetherness somewhat dissipated over the course of the pandemic. I mean, first of all, we got comfortable with a lot more infection and dying than we were at the beginning, not just in the United States, but maybe most conspicuously here. And then once the vaccines arrived in 2021, we didn't do an especially good job of sharing them with the whole world. There was some distribution, there were some donations, but it took an incredibly long time to get even the majority of the world vaccinated well after the rich countries of the world had accomplished it. And, in a certain way, the cost was smaller than it might be with a different disease because the disease was so focused on the elderly. And in the developing world, there are many fewer elderly people, which meant there was much less vulnerability there. And yet, I think a lot about a report that the IMF put together in the summer of 2021, saying that the whole world could be vaccinated for a cost of $50 billion. They said that this would be sufficient to actually retire the disease, and that the returns to that investment just by 2025 were going to be 9 trillion. So they were saying that an investment in a global vaccination program would pay off more than 100-fold. And yet we didn't do anything like that. We attacked the pandemic nationally, not internationally. So I think it's true at the level of ideas. You and I sitting up here, maybe many people in the audience say, yes, of course, this illustrates that we have global problems that require global solutions. But is the world as it's constituted today capable of generating those solutions? How do you assess that capacity?
How do I assess that? On the one hand, there's no alternative, because if we don't come up with global solutions, we're finished. On the other hand, as you say, our response to COVID has not been sufficient. Initially, there was a frightened response to COVID. I had hoped that the response would blossom to the point where those countries with vaccines would make them available to the rest of the world, not out of generosity, but out of selfish interest. The United States knowing that as long as there's COVID in Bolivia and Zambia, there's going to be COVID persisting in the United States, and we have to eliminate COVID, or else we won't free ourselves of COVID. There has been some global response, but not nearly enough global response. What might make me hopeful? Some of the bad things that make me hopeful is that COVID is still evolving. There are new strains. Some of those new strains may have higher mortalities. The 2% mortality of unvaccinated people from COVID, a 2% death rate was not enough to mobilize the whole world. In the case of smallpox, with a 30 to 50% unvaccinated mortality, that was enough to mobilize the world, and the world eliminated smallpox in 1980. But there are going to be more emerging diseases. There will be more strains of COVID, and it may be that the next strain of COVID or the next emerging diseases will have a death toll not of 2%, but of 5% or 20%. And that really will attract the attention of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of those dynamics will certainly shape our response, but I also, and I don't mean to be playing too much the pessimist, there are plenty I'll be expressing optimism about later too, but when I think about the way that the United States, for instance, has evolved culturally and politically around COVID over the last year or two, it doesn't strike me as intuitive that in the next pandemic, we will be more aggressive, more responsive. It strikes me actually that even many people who are pushing for a quite aggressive response in 2020 have started to think that we overreached. And I don't even mean to ask whether we did or not. I just think the trajectory of the public health response has not been to point to a future in which we do more to protect one another. It's worryingly to me, even over the course of just a couple of years, points in the direction of every man for himself.
This gets into the broader question, David, that you and I have chatted about the grounds for hope. What stance do we all take personally, given the big problems of the world? There's the disappointing response to COVID. There's the disappointing response to climate change. There is the disappointing response to inequality around the world. There is the disappointing response to resource depletion around the world. And by now, I suspect that some of you are starting to turn your ears off because you think, oh my God, we're gonna have a doom and gloom for the next 45 minutes. So those are grounds to be pessimistic, but there are also grounds to be optimistic. You and I were just in a session with students of whom I think all were under the age of 25. When I was in college, so I graduated in 1958. I was in college 54 to 58. And during my 4 years of college, there was only one student demonstration. It was a brief demonstration against the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Just one student demonstration. Nowadays, students are more active. They're active politically. My wife, who's 11 years younger than I, my wife was nevertheless old enough to get tear gassed. Students today are more active, much more active. And so the increasing concern of young people gives me hope. Why should young people be concerned? Because young people, my kids, my twin sons who are 35 years old, they were born in 1987. They're likely to be around in the year 2067. They have an investment in the year 2067. I have no personal investment in the year 2067 because I was born in 2037. So one of the things that gives me hope is the increasing involvement of young people. My kids, when my kids were in kindergarten, already in kindergarten, they demonstrated in Los Angeles on behalf of tropical rainforests. When I was in college, college students couldn't even demonstrate on behalf of anything except Hungary. That's one thing that gives me hope. And another thing that gives me hope in the last, two more things that give me hope. First, a short thing that gives me hope. 6 years ago, if you had asked me, what prospect do I see that Americans will take climate change seriously? 6 years ago, I would have said, oh my God, the United States is not going to take it seriously. I never would have guessed that now, 6 years after my pessimism was 6 years ago, that now recognition of climate change is mainstream in the United States. And not only is recognition of climate change mainstream, but the recognition that it's caused by people is also mainstream. So that's another thing that gives me hope. And then a final thing one more thing that gives me hope is the change in big businesses in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, I would have said that the most evil, destructive forces in the world today are big businesses. But in the course of the last 20 years, more and more big businesses have seen that it's in their self-interest to take good care of the environment, to ensure that the world is going to be sustainable. Why? Because CEOs have children, just as do other people, and the CEOs are recognizing that the world of their children is being jeopardized if big businesses are operating non-sustainably. And also big businesses have discovered that there are lots of ways that they make more money if they operate sustainably. And so, for example, Walmart, my wife and I have a good relationship where we can discuss anything except Walmart. We cannot discuss Walmart because having involvement with Walmart, I recognize the many things that Walmart is doing to operate sustainably, but they're not talking about it. But my wife and many other people don't want to hear any good things about Walmart. But the fact is that Walmart and Unilever, and there are a lot of other big businesses, even some of the big oil companies, believe it or not, Chevron and BP, some of the other big Shell, some of the big companies are doing some good sustainable things some of the time. So those are some of the things that make me hopeful.
Yeah, I don't think I can get on board with the oil companies, but I do think really there is there has, especially around climate, there's been a remarkable transformation of the landscape over the last 5 years, which is really the time that I've spent most deeply in this field and worrying about it. My book, The Uninhabitable Earth, I finished it in the fall of 2018, so 4 years ago. No one had heard of Greta Thunberg then. She had just started striking outside of the Swedish parliament. She was a lonely, friendless 15-year-old by herself. Nobody had heard of the Green New Deal. That was a third-party candidate in the U.S. previous presidential election. It was her. I'm blanking on her name. It was the name for her climate platform. Nobody had heard of the Sunrise Movement or Extinction Rebellion. We've had over these 5 years this global political mobilization with climate strikes numbering in the millions on every continent, visible to everyone watching the news, and testifying exactly what you're saying, that the younger generation really cares. But it hasn't just been a revolt of the younger generation. It's also been, in part because of that influence from child to CEO, child to prime minister, but also because the people in those positions of power are just looking out their windows and seeing the momentum of change. It's become a political cause of the first order. It may not be as high a priority as I would like it to be for the world's presidents and prime ministers, but they talk about climate change alongside their other top priorities now in a way that they never did before. And they are making promises, most part, sort of vague promises that we have to hold them to, but they're making promises to decarbonize that go well beyond anything that anyone had promised before. As recently as the Paris Accords in 2015, no country was talking about getting all the way to zero emissions. Nobody was even talking about that. They were just talking about reducing their emissions. And now 90% of the world's GDP and 90% of our global emissions are under net zero pledges, countries that have promised to get to net zero. As I said, a lot of that's paper pledges. You know, we have to hold them to it. They're not going to hold themselves to it. But just at the level of political rhetoric and awareness, it is an unbelievable watershed. And in part, you know, related is the fact that alongside this set of developments, renewable energy has dropped in price so much that anyone making long-term investments, 20-year, 30-year, 40-year plans for their countries or even their companies, now see a much brighter future through renewable power than through fossil fuel power. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, recently called solar power the cheapest electricity in history. 90% of the world's population, it's been estimated, lives in places where renewable energy, new renewable energy, is cheaper than new dirty energy. This is a whole new landscape. You know, the fight isn't over. We haven't even peaked emissions, which means we're still doing more damage every year now than we've ever done before. But we have set ourselves up over the next decade or two to really make a turn. And the end result of all that math is that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when scientists talked about business as usual warming, they talked about 4 degrees or 5 degrees Celsius of warming, which is about 3 or 4 times what we've had today. And now they talk about 2 or 3 degrees, which is twice what we have today. So we've about cut in half our expected amount of global warming in just 5 or 6 years. And that's encouraging for many reasons, not least of which, you know, 3 degrees is much better than 5, 2 degrees is much better than 4, but also because it suggests that a lot more could change in the next 5 years and the 5 years after that. And, you know, when the people talking about these energy technologies talk about these things, they're called S-curves. Things change slowly for a long time and then they change really quickly. And that's happening in all the renewable technology, but it's also happening in our culture, in our politics. And we're not there yet. You know, we're still very far off of our climate targets. But, you know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, if you had asked me, I would have said, when has climate activism ever achieved anything? And now I think, well, it's really changed the world. It hasn't made it perfectly safe and perfectly stable. We're going to be dealing with some amount of disarray. But the whole arc of the 21st century has been changed by concern for our climate future. And that's, you know, pretty inspiring. But, you know, climate change isn't the only thing that we're facing. So I don't know if you know the term polycrisis that people have been using a little bit over the last couple of years to refer to all of these things at once. You know, climate's one of them, but, you know, the energy crisis, you know, China, conflict with China, nuclear risk, war in Ukraine, all the rest of it. When you start to take the really big picture, even pulling back from climate or from resource deplete, like, how do you think about how these things fit together? What is your framework for thinking about all of the various crises that we face and how they fit together? I don't know if there's like a cartoon that people published at the beginning of the pandemic with a series of tidal waves, and the first one was COVID-19, and then behind it was the climate crisis, and behind that was the biodiversity crisis. And how do you think about how all these things fit together? And I don't want to ask you to rank them, but like, what's the framework that you use to think about all of the assorted challenges of the 21st century that we're talking about?
The framework that I use as a result of having been born in 1937, I often, I and you and other people, we feel that our present situation is unique, that this is the worst crisis in our lifetimes and in human history. Well, if you were born in the last few decades, it may be the impending worst crisis in the last couple of decades. But go back to 1937. My first datable memory was in 1942. It was the memory of a famous photograph of 2 American soldiers dead, face down in Buna Beach in New Guinea. I grew up during World War II, than which nothing could be worse. When I was 8 years old, the concentration camps were opened, and we saw the bulldozers pushing dead bodies, because there were so many dead bodies, into trenches. Nothing could have been worse than the Holocaust. And then came the nuclear race between the Soviet Union and the United States and the fear during the 1950s of a preemptive attack. And then came the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when it was clear at the time, and when we know in retrospect, that the world really did come close to an exchange of nuclear weapons. And then came the Vietnam War, et cetera, all of which means that today, when we are immersed in the poly crisis of today, this seems uniquely bad. But if you saw the dead Americans on Buena Beach, and if you saw the bulldozers at the concentration camps, and if you grew up during the arms race, and if you lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, there have been bad crises before. What can all of you do about it? And particularly those of you who are under the age of 25 and have an investment, a long investment in the future, much longer investment than I, and even a longer investment than young David here. So what can you do for the future? The first thing you could do, today is 6 days short of a midterm election. Next week, go out and vote. The highest turnout for a national election ever in the United States was 70%. The highest turnout before that was 62%. That is miserable. In Indonesia, in its first democratic election, 93% of Indonesians voted in Indonesia's first democratic election. In Italy, after World War II, the turnout for national elections fluctuated between 85 and 93%. If we Americans get a government with which we are dissatisfied, it's entirely our own fault for not being bothered to vote. So the first thing you can do is not just go out and vote, but tell your friends to vote. Some elections get decided by very small margins, such as the presidential election of 2020, or, of 20, what was it? The Gore-Bush election.
2000, yeah.
And there was an election for the governor of Washington that was decided by something like 387 votes. So vote and convince 194 of your friends to vote. That would overturn the result of the election for the state of Washington. That's one cheap and easy thing you can do. Another cheap and easy thing you can do, all of you who are under 25, talk to your parents. Your parents are undoubtedly, on the average, richer and more powerful than you. You have a unique hold on the ear of your parents. If you are dissatisfied with what your parents do about the state of the world, then say to your parents, as a friend of mine who is the son of the CEO of one of the world's biggest companies, my friend said to his father, "Dad, I am ashamed of you and what your company is doing. It's disgusting, and I am not going to speak to you until you change the policies of your company." That really gets the attention of parents. You young people can say that. A third thing that you can do is buy selectively and picket selectively and intelligently. Big companies differ in their policies, even within the same industry. Among the oil companies, about which, David, I sense that you suggest you felt some reservations. The oil companies are different from each other. There are some oil companies that are better and some oil companies that are worse. Buy your gasoline at the better oil companies, and it's easy to find out which are the better oil companies. Just see which oil companies have poured money into combating climate change. And then a final thing that you can do, you young people are about to decide on your careers, what you want to do for your lives. What should you do for your life? Well, a friend of mine, the famous late Tom Lovejoy, who died just after Christmas. Tom asked his father when Tom was a teenager, that what should I do? What career should I choose? And his father said, whatever career you choose, it should satisfy 4 conditions. Number 1, it should be something that you enjoy. Number 2, it should be something that you are good at. Number 3, it should be something that enables you to earn a living. And number 4, it should be something that is good for the world. So all of you young people who are thinking what you want to do for the rest of your lives, pick something that you're good at, that you enjoy, and that will help you earn a living, but also pick something that will do good for the
That's an inspiring message. It also is built on a sort of vision of the world that remains ours to shape. And I wonder if you think that we, so many of us, maybe especially young people, maybe especially thinking about the climate crisis and what to do about it, whether we fall into traps of deterministic thinking and not feeling like we really control our fate. Yeah.
Do we control our fate? For heaven's sakes, in the case of the climate crisis, there are crises that are beyond our control, and there are crises that are completely under our control. A crisis that is beyond our control is an asteroid hurtling towards us, such as the one of 66 million years ago that did in the dinosaurs. Yes, we had this experiment of last week about slightly deflecting the orbit of a very tiny asteroid. But the fact is that any decent-sized asteroid, there's nothing that we can do about it. At the opposite extreme is climate change. Climate change is completely under our control because it's not at all exogenous. Climate change is due entirely to the effects of humans today. And if we stopped causing the effects by stopping consuming so much energy and stopping burning so much fossil fuel, we would not have a climate crisis. It's in our power to end the climate crisis. Now, obviously, it's not as simple as that because there is the lack of political will. But really the only obstacle between us and solving the climate crisis is the lack of political will. And so it's in our power to end the climate, to solve the climate crisis by mobilizing the necessary political will. That's not going to be easy, but it's much easier than deflecting the asteroid that 66 million years ago killed off the dinosaurs.
Yeah, I mean, the part of it, the part of that story that worries me is that, I talked a few minutes ago about how encouraging it is that we've sort of cut almost in half our expected level of global warming this century. And that's obviously great news. But it's also brought our expected level of warming down to somewhere 2.5 degrees, somewhere in there probably, maybe a little higher depending on who you want to ask. And that's a level of warming that the rich nations of the world are likely to suffer through but manage. And the poor nations of the world will have a much harder time with. And I think it's, I find myself falling into a trap where I think of this as like, we can solve this problem in a whiteboard with a couple of scientists drawing, new lines about the energy transition on a whiteboard. When in fact, so many of the harder challenges are political, tied up in global dynamics that are competitive as opposed to cooperative. And it gets back to something you said earlier on in the conversation about global solutions to global problems, but it feels like we've solved a lot of these technical problems, especially about climate. We know what we have to do. We got to get fossil fuels. We got to stop using fossil fuels. We got to electrify everything. We got to figure out some solutions for industry and agriculture and infrastructure and everything else that contributes to the problem. But the technical side of the equation, it's only half the equation, right? And the other challenges seem really quite large to me. We're living in a more cooperative world than we were living in 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But I don't know that we're living in a more cooperative world than we were living in 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And I worry about how that's all going to play out. We could end up, having solved the climate crisis, having limited warming to something like 2 degrees, and yet people in places like the United States, more or less ignoring the suffering that level of warming creates in the poorer parts of the world as we are already.
I'm going to push on the grounds for optimism, despite. Grounds for optimism. One again is you mentioned correctly that the big problems have technological components to them, but in the case of climate change, the biggest issue, even more than technology, is the issue of political will, and particularly political will at the worldwide level. I think back over the last 50 years about the big, daunting global problems that the world solved by mustering the political will and took the political will of the whole world. The elimination of smallpox, the worst disease in human history, with an unvaccinated mortality, something like 50%. Smallpox was eliminated in 1980 by a worldwide effort. It required the cooperation of every single country in the world, because if smallpox survived anywhere, smallpox would remain on the face of the earth. The last country that had cases of smallpox was Somalia. Boy, if you try to think of a country that's going to be difficult to eliminate any disease, no country could be more difficult than Somalia. But that worldwide, the last cases of smallpox were in Somalia, and this WHO effort in 1980 eliminated smallpox. That was difficult, but the world succeeded. The Montreal Protocol that got fluorocarbons out of the atmosphere and protected the ozone layer required the agreement of every country on Earth not to tolerate the manufacture of fluorocarbons. It succeeded. The Montreal Protocol banned the production of fluorocarbons. There are a couple of rogue actors now, but on a very minor level. The world agreement to mandate that oil tankers on the high seas be double-hulled. Single-hull tankers are, if they puncture, there's a big oil spill. And so the proposal was made that all oil tankers on the high seas ought to be double-hulled. Again, there was a lot of kicking and screaming of countries that did not want to double-hull their tankers. But an agreement was reached. I think it's called the Marpol Agreement, that banned single-hull tankers on the high seas. And then the agreement to delineate coastal economic zones. God, if you think of something difficult to reach agreement on, all the countries in the world that have seacoasts, I think it was finally in the 1990s, an agreement was reached between every pair of neighboring countries that have overlapping seacoast to delineate their economic zones. So those are worldwide agreements of really difficult issues that the world nevertheless succeeded in achieving. Those are reasons that I'm hopeful, and a reason that I'm especially hopeful in the case of climate change, despite all the grounds for pessimism that keep me awake as well as you awake about climate change. Something like, I believe 62% of the world's greenhouse gases are produced by 5 political entities. And those entities are, of course, China, the United States, Japan, the European Union, and India. If those 5 entities reached an agreement about fossil fuel consumption, those 5 entities could then force their decision on the other 38% by import duties and regulations. An agreement among just 5 entities would suffice to produce a worldwide agreement for fossil fuels. Is that likely given all the tension between China and the United States today? Yes, I think it is likely. China is a country that I'm having a lot of secondhand involvement with nowadays, and I do a lot of speaking to China, and I have to be careful about what I say when I give talks to China. In my talks to China, I do not refer to the status of Taiwan, but in my talks to China, I frequently talk about climate change, and I talk about the necessity for China's self-interest. China has big problems with climate change, which they know about, and I point out that China is not going to solve its problems of climate change until China collaborates with the United States and the EU and Japan and India to address climate change, because if China doesn't do that, China has to do it in its own self-interest. So that fact that it doesn't take 226 countries to agree, it takes 5 entities to agree, that will probably produce a solution to the climate change issue. That's another thing that makes me cautiously optimistic. When people ask me, Jared, what do you think of the chances that we will have a happy ending by the year 2050? I say I'm cautiously optimistic. I rate the chances as at least 51% that things will end up okay, and no worse than 49% that we'll have a bad ending.
Yeah, I mean, I think the prospects for progress on climate are really strong for a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about. And I think China's done a lot of good already, not just within their own borders, but they've basically been manufacturing all of the solar panels that the world has been using for the last decade or so. So a lot of the cheap solar that we talk about coming out of China. Unfortunately, it's also, a lot of it's coming out of really oppressive labor conditions. And, we're now engaged in a sort of possibly rapidly escalating trade war about polysilicon production, which could, in theory, mean that cheap solar power is restricted from other countries' use. So even in a situation where most countries in the world are eager to get moving more quickly on the green transition, it's in a spirit of almost like a new gold rush, which might ultimately disadvantage us because a country like China might just decide, well, we're going to be like the lithium kings here, or we're going to be the polysilicon kings. We're not going to cooperate in the same trade basis that we have in the past. I don't know how that's all going to play out, but it does feel like the period of quasi deglobalization that we're heading into raises a lot of questions about many of these dynamics, which we don't really have good answers to. But it sounds to me, the way that you're talking about the recent past and the near future, that you don't think about this in terms of significant deglobalization. You still think of this as a quite globalized world. Do you see the future holding to that pattern, or how do you?
Do I see the future holding to that pattern? For sure, unless my sons would laugh at this conversation, because my sons would say, our daddy would like to abolish computers and the internet and deglobalize the world. It's true, theoretically I would, but it's not going to happen. The world is, why is the world globalized? It's globalized because of technology. People are not going to throw away their cell phones. People are not going to throw away their internet connection. Everything is going to make the world more globalized. Nothing that's happening now is going to make the world less globalized, except for a full-fledged exchange of nuclear weapons that will eliminate the jet airplanes and end globalization. So, yes, there's more globalization awaiting us.
So when you think about especially the work that you did in Collapse, looking at the dynamics of civilizational collapse in the past, when countries were far more isolated and than they are today, how do you connect that to the situation of things? I mean, if you say, okay, we've got a 51% chance of things turning out okay, that's still a 49% chance of things not turning out okay. How do you think about, the lessons of that deeper history for the present crisis? What should we be thinking about? How should we be pushing our politics and our behavior, outside, not just in the realm of climate, but more generally, so that we avoid the destructive paths that you documented so powerfully in that book?
The lessons of deeper history are that throughout repeatedly, societies, many societies, not all societies, maybe not even most societies, but many societies have inadvertently mismanaged environmental resources on which they depended, with the result being self-destruction. And iconic examples are the Easter Islanders chopping down all their trees, the classic lowland Maya, the most advanced pre-Columbian civilization in the New World, again, deforesting and having problems of soil management. The Fertile Crescent, the birthplace of agriculture and the birthplace of metal tools, the birthplace of writing. For nearly 10,000 years, the Fertile Crescent led the world. The Fertile Crescent, that crescent-shaped band of land that runs from Iran through Syria, Iraq, southeastern Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. The Fertile Crescent led the world for 10,000 years and no longer comes anywhere close to leading. Why not? Fertile Crescent is environmentally at risk. It's a relatively dry environment, which is easy to deforest. So there are many societies in the New World that destroyed themselves by mismanaging their resources. But in the past, before globalization, when a society destroyed itself, most of the rest of the world didn't know about it. When Easter Island destroyed itself, nobody in the world knew about it. And when the classic lowland Maya civilization collapsed, not even in the Valley of Mexico, not even at Teotihuacan, was it known. The difference between the past, when societies could destroy themselves by mismanagement, and the present, when societies can destroy themselves by mismanagement, is that the risk that we face now is of worldwide collapse. It is impossible now for there to be collapses of societies one by one in isolation, because when a society collapses, when Afghanistan or Somalia runs into trouble, it affects the rest of the world, and in go the troops and big political consequences. So the risk that we face today is the risk of a worldwide collapse. Again, one could be pessimistic about that, but the risk of a worldwide collapse also gives me causes for cautious optimism, because it will eventually dawn on enough Americans and Chinese and Indians and Japanese and Europeans that when there's trouble in Afghanistan and in Mali and in Paraguay, there is going to be with certainty trouble in China and India and Japan and the United States and the EU. So another grounds for cautious optimism.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't worry so much about global collapse. I guess maybe it feels far enough off to me, or maybe I think we're doing a good enough job on the main measures. What worries me more is that we just move into a future that's full of much more suffering than we need to be experiencing. And I sometimes think, I'm in this climate space, I get asked all the time about optimism or pessimism. Everybody's thinking is so binary. And, the truth is, probably we've eliminated the most apocalyptic scenarios, but we've also lost the opportunity for a normal climate future. The disruptions that's going to produce are in some ways manageable, in some ways not, but overall they just amount to more suffering than we had to have in our future. And yet that is the future that we're building. And so, I wonder how you think about all these issues, but there are times when I'm comforted by the arc of history and think we've been through, in deep history, but also in recent history, been through a lot of challenging times and come through it. People are, globally speaking, better off than they were generations ago. There's certainly less horrible poverty all around the world. More people are going to school. Childbirth is declining. There are all of these measures that tell us that we're in a much better time than we used to be in. But I also feel like there's some poverty of moral and political imagination in that doesn't hold ourselves also to a standard of how much better the world could be if we moved more aggressively in that direction. And being just happy that like the world survives, or just happy that the world is a little bit better than it used to be, I don't know, it doesn't feel like it's enough to me. I think that these questions of distribution loom really large, and I don't want to lose sight of the progress that we've made, or the good news, or the way that counsels optimism in the face of new challenges. But I also think we have to also remember that we have an opportunity to do much better than we've ever done in the past, not just not do worse. And I would like to see a world that embraces that value set a little bit more affirmatively, particularly on climate, but on other issues as well.
If you're hoping, David, that unhappiness will vanish from the world, my prediction is that your hope will not be achieved. If on the other hand, a realistic hope, as you note, in many respects, in most respects, with one big exception, the world has been getting better and better for the last several centuries. The number of people who've died violent deaths in modern society is much lower than in the traditional tribal societies of New Guinea, where I do my fieldwork. The fact is that the imposition of state government around the world has reduced violent death. Even though my wife's family is from Poland, Poland had the worst mortalities during World War II, despite which those Poles who died of violent death during the 20th century are much lower percent than in tribal societies around the world for wherever we have the knowledge. So violence has decreased because of the imposition of state government. Health has increased, lifespan has increased. Things are getting better. Doesn't mean that we'll solve, that we'll be like Voltaire and be the happiest we ever could be. No, we'll be imperfect, but I'm cautiously optimistic that what I care about, that my own kids, instead of ending up in a bombed out world in the year 2050, I'm optimistic for my own kids and all of you, you quotes kids here who be graduating Queens, that you will end up in a world worth living in where most of you will have happy lives.
Well, on that note, I think we've got some questions from some students that we'll take now.
Thank you, Jared and David. I'd now like to introduce 3 students who have joined us tonight. Each has a question for our speakers. The first up is Everly Reyes, class of 2024, political science and government major.
I have a question for both our speakers. As someone who has tried to shop sustainably and alter their habits to be eco-friendly because of the detrimental impacts of global warming, I feel that what I do is insignificant compared to these big corporations that emit large amounts of pollution every second. What could people like me do to mitigate these impacts on a larger scale?
Well, you're not wrong. Individual actions can make a difference. I mean, the things that individuals can do to deal with climate change, I always say the 3 biggest things are don't fly, change your diet, and get an EV if you can. But ultimately, the differences that can be made through choices like those, even if they scale at a very big scale, are smaller than the differences that can be made through policy change, which means to me the most important thing that any individual feeling overwhelmed by the climate crisis should do is to engage politically, to vote as the bare minimum. But, you know, Jared was talking about picketing and protesting. And, you know, there are a lot of people in the climate space who talk a lot about the simple empowering act of conversations. You were talking about this too earlier. There are many more people who are worried about the climate crisis than talk about it regularly, even with the people they love. And that means that everyone feels a little more alone than they need to in this struggle. Ultimately, if we want to really reorganize our society to stabilize global climate temperatures, that requires getting all the way to zero, making no new carbon at all. And that means not just changing our power system and our electricity system, but also our transportation system, our infrastructure, our agriculture, our industry, all of that stuff. And that's a really big project, which is what politics is for. And we often feel as individuals relating to the political challenges, I think, that we're living in a state of hypocrisy, or at least I feel that sometimes. You know, I try to be responsible, but I'm not a perfect climate actor. I think almost nobody on the planet is today. But I think one of the really empowering things about about politics is that what we think of as hypocrisy is really our desire to see a better world collectively than we can engineer as individuals. And that's good. Like, if you want the world to be more responsible on climate change than you can manage in your individual life, that's good. And I'm sure almost everyone in this room feels the same way. And that's politics. That's political power. We need to leverage it. We need to push it forward. But the concern is there all across the country, all across the world, and it's growing, which means it's no longer really a question of whether we're going to tackle this problem. It's just whether we're going to tackle it in time to prevent some really scary outcomes. And that's still up in the air, but the answer will be primarily determined by the actions we take as political actors, not as consumers. Anything to add?
You're fine. Let's have the next question.
Jerry Bruschetta, class of 2024, international studies and philosophy major.
So I have a question for Dr. Diamond. The climate change crisis, which is very unique for many reasons. One of them is that it is global crisis that can be addressed without the participation of all significant greenhouse gases emitters. However, in light of recent development regarding tensions around Taiwan, China announced the suspension of cooperation on climate change with the United States. How big do you think this is the problem for moving on in the future? Yes.
My one sentence of Czech. All right. So What about China and the U.S.?
Where's your mic?
What about China and the U.S. with the growing tensions between China and the U.S.? I hope and expect that those tensions will be overridden by self-interest. Climate change is, if anything, a bigger problem for China than it is for the United States. China is suffering from even worse environmental problems than is the United States. It's true that at present, Taiwan seems to be in the forefront, but there are enough people, including the leader of China, who know that if conflict breaks out between the United States and China over Taiwan, China's chances of solving its own problems go to zero. China's major problems require cooperation with the United States. And I expect that there will be saber rattling over the next years, and that there will be disputes over Taiwan and other things, but that ultimately self-interest will force China and also force the United States to cooperate with each other, because if China and we do not cooperate with each other, both of us are finished.
I'll just add one little thing about that, in this about self-interest, which is that this is another dynamic that's really changed because of all the other things we talked about, but primarily the market transformation. So if national leaders making medium and long-term plans now universally see a greener transition as a better path, that means that that cooperation is no longer a burden in the way that it seemed just 5 or 10 years ago for climate. 5 or 10 years ago, it seemed as though people were going to have to undertake, it was going to be a moral undertaking that would nevertheless be burdensome to cut emissions. Things are going to be bumpy in the transition, but they're not actually going to be a net cost. We know that now, all global leaders know that now, and that means that it's a lot easier to ask someone to cooperate because they're not foregoing some amount of wealth in doing so. In fact, quite the opposite.
Amina Bekic, class of 2024, political science and government major.
My question is for Mr. David Wallace-Wells. Both of you touched on this earlier in the conversation, but as political science students, we're deeply interested in how the government can play a role in reducing these imminent effects of climate change. What are some steps the government on all levels, including federal, state, and local, can take to address this issue? And what can we do as political actors to make sure that our representatives have these issues at the forefront of their agendas?
Well, you were asking about mitigating impacts as opposed to cutting emissions, right? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, an emerging part of the story, or a growing part of the story. 10, 15 years ago, people in the climate world didn't like talking about adaptation. They didn't like talking about resilience because they thought it distracted from the need to cut emissions. But climate impacts are here now. They're damaging now. We see that every day. And as a result, we need a kind of a climate politics that responds to that at all the levels that you're talking about. Thankfully, it's also something that we can respond to locally, which means we don't have to have the right president in the White House. We don't have to have the right premier in Beijing to take action. We can do that locally through local resilience projects, which make themselves irresistible once people locally recognize the threat. So that means, at the level of urban planning and, depending on where you live and in what kind of context, you can talk about replanting wetlands and regrowing mangroves to protect against flooding. It means trying to push for state level legislation or even local action around building codes to make them more resilient in the face of, say, flooding or wind. In California, there's a lot being done around making making homes more fire resilient through building codes. These are things that have to be undertaken at the global scale, at the national scale. But I think it's kind of empowering that they can also be taken at the individual scale, including literally at the level of like the individual person who's trying to make their own home safer. Those may feel like sort of narcissistic, selfish actions, but they're also playing a role in climate resilience, which we all have to do.
I would just add, David, two small points to that. One is specifically on what government can do. Government can play a role in subsidizing the development of more cost-efficient, sustainable energy production. At the time of the Gulf oil crisis of, 50 years ago, the US government for about 7 years invested heavily in supporting the development of wind farms. And the result was that in the United States, super duper windmills were produced, but the government then, US government then stopped support after the development of these super duper windmills. So who built the super duper? Denmark. Denmark now uses those American designed windmills to produce 20% of its energy grid. That's an example of how the government, by supporting, for example, the development of effective tidal energy, using the tides to generate energy. That's a role that government could play. But the other thing that I want to say, and perhaps this is a good note on which to end, is don't look to government to solve everything, and don't look to government as the only solution. There's a lot that individuals and non-governmental groups and businesses can do without waiting for government. And an example, a nice example on which to end is that I wrote an article with a German friend about business crises, and my German friend pointed out the following. Some years ago in Germany, German farmers were complaining because of changes in agricultural production in Germany, and German farmers were asking the German government to subsidize German farmers more. And the appropriate response of the German government was, the problems of German farmers are more deep-seated than matters of providing a subsidy. They are caused by climate change, which means that Germany and the Czech Republic and the rest of Europe are getting warmer, and the forms of agriculture that were productive in Germany in the past are no longer productive. So German farmers have to change their mode of operation. Any of you who love German wines as I do, the dry Moselle wines of the 1960s, when I began drinking wine, the Moselle no longer produces dry wines because of climate change. It produces sweet wines. Moselle wine producers have to go to an effort to continue to produce dry wine. So in summary then, government can help with solving these problems, but government is not the only source of solutions. Our big problems can be solved by you as individuals, and by us as groups, and by non-governmental organizations.
On behalf of the Queen's Learning Society, I wanted to thank you both so much for joining us this evening. I hope everyone learned as much as I did from our speakers. We're very grateful for their time and their talents. I want to wish everyone a good evening and to enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks for coming.